Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining the Air Care Alliance's virtual town hall this evening. I see so many familiar names coming into the attendee list here. I really appreciate everybody being with us tonight. My name is Christina Luke, and I'm the Executive Director of the Air Care Alliance, and I'm joined tonight by three presenters who each will be discussing one of the hot topics in public benefit flying. Tonight, we'll be covering regulatory considerations, call signs, and pandemic response. We've got a lot of information to get through and only an hour to do it, so I'm going to try to be a really strict timekeeper. Each speaker will give a 10-minute overview of their topic, and then we'll reserve about 5 minutes or so for questions after each speaker. You can feel free to enter any questions that you may have along the way into the Q&A, and we'll do our best to work our way through those as we go along. As a reminder, this session will be recorded and it'll be available. I'm going to kick things off by introducing our first presenter, Rick Durden. Rick is an aviation attorney, public benefit flying consultant, and chair of the ACA Industry Relations Committee. He is an expert witness on aviation law, pilot operations, and aircraft operational safety, and has been a volunteer pilot for Lighthawk for 30 years. Rick is the author of numerous articles and presentations on aviation safety, including The Thinking Pilot's Flight Manual, or How to Survive Flying Little Airplanes and Have a Ball Doing It. Rick will be addressing regulatory considerations in volunteer flying and why it matters. Over to you, Rick.
Chris, thank you very much. And I'll go ahead with the first slide, Chris. And okay, we'll be talking, go ahead and move forward in it. The conclusions of this program are based on research by a number of aviation attorneys, analysis of FAA letters of interpretation, and conversation with FAA attorneys and staffers. We are always looking for hard data and citations into the regulations, and we're continuing to look at the regs. And with a number of participants here, we're working to convince the FAA to make changes to the regs to make more volunteer flights possible while maintaining the current level of safety. For those of you working to make the regs more volunteer pilot friendly, we're your biggest cheerleaders, and we'll do what we can to help. Due to time constraints, this will be a high altitude look at the topic. We urge you to read the letter on volunteer flight and the FARs on the ACA website as it goes into much more detail. Keep in mind, when you're looking and interpreting regs, the FAA's responsibility is to protect the innocent, not to make pilots' lives easier. I'll also point out that the FAA and NTSB are very familiar with public benefit flying, and they support it. Their concern, however, is protection of passengers. Okay, Chris, the next slide.
Sorry about that.
Volunteer pilot transportation flights are operated under Part 91, duh. It's the least restrictive on pilots and maintenance. It also provides the lowest levels of protection for innocent passengers and the things we carry. The first premise, passengers pay nothing. Also, the pilot cannot be compensated and still operate under Part 91 for volunteer transportation flights, unless there is a specific exemption or exception to the regulations. And the Civil Air Patrol has just that. If the pilot is compensated, the flight must be operated under Part 135 air taxi regulations, or it's an illegal charter. Okay, Chris. The FAA has long defined compensation, and it's anything of value. If the pilot does not pay the full cost of her or his flight, that pilot is receiving compensation per the FAA. Fuel reimbursement is compensation. Free or reduced price flying time is compensation because it counts toward time for a rating or simple recency of experience requirements for the pilot. Under Part 91 public benefit flying, you fly, you pay. You can't use OPM, other people's money. Next slide, please. To receive fuel reimbursement, you and the VPO, Volunteer Pilot Organization, must have an exemption from the FAA, and both of you must comply with it. Now, a few years ago, there was some legislation that wasn't especially well written on the subject of fuel reimbursement, and it allowed the FAA to blow off the regulation. So they did. So it still means if you are to get a fuel reimbursement, you've got to comply with a published exemption for you and the VPO. Sometimes we get asked the question, can you take a fuel discount? It's not unusual for FBOs or oil companies to offer a price discount for volunteer flights. The FAA has not ruled on this, but in our best opinion, if the discount is modest, it's probably okay. And next slide. The volunteer pilot organization cannot pick up any portion of the cost of a volunteer flight. Well, the pilot isn't a volunteer then. If the VPO picks up any portion of the cost, it's a flight for hire, and it can't be operated under Part 91. It's got to be under Part 135. Let's go to the next slide. If the VPO owns an airplane, it cannot be used for volunteer flights involving transportation of people, pets, or cargo. It's compensation to the pilot and must be flown at Part 135. Now, there are more details on this in the ACA letter. The FAA will rule that the VPO owning an airplane is a transportation company, and it must operate under Part 135. The VPO is not a corporation using an aircraft incidental to its primary business, because its primary business is transportation of people, pets, or cargo. Doing good does not shield you from compliance with the FARs or lawsuits. This is an area that there's been a lot of discussion. No matter what kind of good work you're doing, you must comply with the FARs. And that also applies if you're flying an unregistered airplane anywhere in the world, not just the US. Well, as pilots, we are in the business of risk assessment and management. So what are the risks of not complying with the regs? Well, in a single word, they're serious. It's likely that your illegal charter will void your insurance. You purchased insurance for Part 91 operations. If you are flying an illegal charter, the insurer is most likely justified in saying they're not going to pay in the event of an accident. In addition, if you come to the attention of the FAA, you're looking at pilot certificate suspension or revocation. And, well, put it frankly, a chance that you'll really seriously damage public benefit flying. About 10 years ago, we dodged a bullet when the NTSB came out getting ready to advocate for regulations on public benefit flying. The Air Care Alliance did a lot of work with the NTSB. We worked with AOPA and came up with a training program, and the NTSB backed down. But the NTSB and FAA are still looking at us. So we've got to be careful. This issue came up in Australia. The Australians put in very harsh regulations on volunteer flying, and it's pretty well shut down volunteer flying. And I guess I'll put it frankly, an organization's arrogance in thinking that they're too cool so they don't have to comply with the regs could hurt not only the organization and the pilot badly, it could destroy public benefit flying. And as one friend said to me, if you survive the crash, you may get taken out behind the hangar and have some Alaska bush pilot justice applied. Think back to 1986, one crash, the Cerritos midair between a Cherokee 140 and an airliner caused massive changes to the FARs and huge airspace restrictions that brought in TCAs and Class Bravo. All it takes for public benefit flying to be seriously injured is one crash by someone being a jerk and ignoring the regs. Is that blunt enough? Robert Heinlein, a science fiction writer, had a word called Tanstaffel. There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. Bottom line, Part 91, volunteer flying, there's no such thing as free flying time. For a volunteer pilot, you pay for the flight, no matter what ratings you hold. You can't take any free time. And with that, we'll take questions.
Take a look in here and see if we have any questions. You can feel free to go ahead and enter them into the chat if you do. Here's a question for you, Rick. Does this mean that the FAA feels that if you fly without fuel reimbursement, you are safer?
The FAA doesn't have an opinion on that I've seen. It means that the pilot simply cannot accept compensation unless there is an exemption or an exception to the regulations. And whether that's safer or not, I've not seen any opinion.
Let's assume there were no restrictions on reimbursement. What kind of effect might that have on the rest of volunteer aviation?
That's a good question. There's been some questionnaires passed around. Interestingly, a number of pilots say that they will not accept reimbursement because then they're no longer volunteers. And they're very proud of the fact that they are volunteer pilots. They're not mercenaries, which perhaps is a harsh word. But from what I've seen, were there some way to provide some reimbursement, fuel or otherwise, then the number of flights would increase perhaps dramatically. And the concern that goes with that is that then we get time builders in, and they're looking at, oh boy, I can go be a hero volunteer pilot, and I can fly for a lot cheaper, and I can build time to get ratings. And then that scares people to death in terms of safety.
Sure. William Davis has a question. What about cost sharing?
Well, you can't, because under 91, if you and some passengers go for a flight somewhere, you can split the cost. But under volunteer flights, you're not charging your passenger or the cargo or anything like that. The FAA has said you can't cost share because you don't have the same purpose for the flight. You, as the volunteer pilot, would not be making this flight to this destination other than to transport these folks for medical services. The FAA has ruled on this. So there is really no way to share costs on a flight unless, I believe, and that's something I would have to look at, I'm not sure right now, if you and another person decide to be pilot and co-pilot, the two of you can split the costs on that, I believe. And I think that's in the ACA letter.
Do you believe that the FAA has the authority to ignore Section 821? And if so, why?
I don't have any opinion on that subject.
Okay, what if you completed a flight for Pilots and Paws and the receiver offers you a basket full of snacks and goodies? Is this considered some type of compensation?
And on one hand, yes, but I think you get to de minimis. For example, federal employees may not receive any sorts of payoffs or compensation or anything like that, but they can go buy a new car or a used car and negotiate the price without violating the law. So that's one reason I think that we can take discounts on fuel, as long as they're modest. And something like goodies or, gee, thank you, or they buy you dinner after flight, that is so de minimis as to, I think most people would just simply ignore it, and so would the FAA. Unless, then again, every once in a while you run into someone who's unreasonable and raises an issue, and that's how sometimes bad enforcement actions happen. But
Sure.
Overall, I think that's not a big deal.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Are there any limitations on tax deductibility of these flights as far as the FAA is concerned?
The FAA has, and this was Air Care Alliance result, that the FAA originally said you couldn't take tax deductions. The Air Care Alliance worked on that, and the FAA now says it's okay. The tax deduction you can take is if you own the airplane, you can deduct the price of fuel and oil for the flight. If you rent the airplane, you can deduct the entire rental cost of the flight.
Okay, great. So I know that was a lot of information coming at everybody all at once, and I do want to stick to time and respect our other presenters. So we're going to go ahead and move on to our next topic, which is call signs.
Chris, sorry, just to interject here. Rick, if you're able, there are some other questions in the Q&A. If you have an opportunity or time to type those answers in there, I'm sure our attendees would appreciate it, and that would go for the other presenters as well. I know we've got a lot of questions here that we probably can't get to, but perhaps if we can answer them in Q&A, that would be helpful for our attendees.
Okay, and Josh, if you could point me at where to find those, I will.
Yeah, so at the bottom of your screen, the Q&A blurb, if you click on that, it'll pop up a little window, and there's two buttons. One says answer live and the other says type answer. If you click type answer, you could answer some of those questions in there.
Yeah, I have it in sight here, and I will see what I can do to get answers in.
Excellent. I'll look and see if I can answer any of them too and provide answers. Thanks, Rick, and thanks, Chris. Sorry to interject.
No, that's great. Thank you, Josh. I'm glad that you reminded us of that. And just another reminder, we have a host of information available on our website regarding these regulations, including FAA interpretations and advisory circulars. We can go ahead and drop that link into the chat, Josh, if you get a chance. So if anybody wants to take a look there, you're welcome to as well. But we'll move on to call signs, and leading the call sign conversation is our very own Raul Murrow. Many of you know Raul very well, but for those who don't, Raul is the co-founder of the Air Care Alliance, chairman emeritus, and a current director. He's the president of the Emergency Volunteer Air Corps and has served on numerous boards, including the Alliance for Aviation Across America. He is director emeritus of the Recreational Aviation Foundation and serves as executive director of the Wolf Aviation Fund. Raul was instrumental in the creation of the Compassion call sign 20 years ago, and he led the recent efforts to preserve its use for volunteer pilots in the face of changing call sign requirements, ADSB implementation. So Raul's going to give you a little background on the changes and then answer some questions that we receive quite frequently, or maybe some misconceptions that pilots may have about call signs. So I'll stop my share and hand it to you, Raul. Raul.
Yep, just coming. Here we go. All right. If you're seeing something that says Compassion 1, 2, 3, 4, then I've done the right thing. I have roughly 10 or 11 slides, which are very dense. So I'm going to be rushing through them pretty quickly. And if you keep your eye on something and there's a subject you want to expand on, I'm going to try to make sure that we leave a little room for questions. And then also I'm going to be pointing to some additional information, and Chris is going to go even further than that. So we're going to launch this presentation and see if it works. Just one moment here. There's a little bit of history of this. Previously, in fact, I think it jumped one slide. Nope. This is basically an overview of what we're going to be doing today. We're going to talk about the history. We're going to talk about the old system, which was good up till a little over a year ago. We're going to discuss why we have a new system, talk about the procedures for using it, discuss the benefits. We'll get into some common questions and tell you where to find out more. And we'll also deal with questions that come online. And Josh is carefully watching the question board and going to be able to help moderate that. At the very end, we'll probably have some additional time for some questions of all of us. So we'll go into that. So jumping into these, the history up to 1998 was that, people use their IN number. And other than that, they might have tried to put an item in the remarks section of a flight plan, but those are really missed by ATC. They have to sort of take an extra step in order to see the remarks. They have to look it up, and if they don't have a reason to look it up, they're not going to. So controllers really didn't realize that it was a flight any different from any other flight. Now, we did have some pilots who tried to use a lifeguard, and that, as I say, is a big no-no. Lifeguard is for flights which really have to do with saving lives. They have to be time critical. they will deflect just about any airplane or delay just about any airplane in order to get a lifeguard flight to an airport as quickly as possible. And that goes all the way up to the big guy flying Air Force One. I don't know whether they would delay Air Force One, but I imagine they would seriously consider the possibility. In 1998, we brought this to the attention of the FAA in DC and worked with the fellow who's in charge of that whole department back there in Washington. And it was really a very pleasant conversation, a very pleasant task. They worked with us to not only find a way that we could get an international identifier, CMF, with the associated compassion call sign, but also worked out the procedures for its use, because in essence, we would be accepting a call sign on behalf of the public benefit flying community. And the procedures at that time basically said you would take your own call sign, the last 3 or 4 digits, add them to CMF, and that would become the replacement for your IN number. And on the radio, you would call in as Compassion 71 Golf or Compassion 371 Golf. And the reasons for those 2 variations would be if, 2 people happen to have the same last 3 characters in their call sign, they could ask one of them to add the 4th. They're required also under the procedures to put their actual IN number and their PBF group in the remarks. And we publish the procedures and requirements. And remember, with call signs, they are requirements from the FAA, and you must know them and you must follow them like any of the other FARs. So you can look up all of the detail on that and all of the law and all the decisions made in the past. But the bottom line is, if you're given a set of procedures for using call signs, you really must follow them. So on January 1st, 2000, we have a new system. And why did we have to change the old one? It was so convenient. You could just put your last few digits or characters of your IN number on CMF, and it worked just fine. Well, the FAA adopted the ICAO International Flight Plan. We all know that that's what we're supposed to be using when we file flight plans. And part of those requirements, and it has to do with automation and the fact that now computers are tracking your flights through multiple sectors and sometimes through multiple countries. They want that call sign in the flight plan to exactly match the call sign that is being broadcast by ADSB. The bottom line is that you have to have a programmable ADSB transmitter in order to do that. We know that ADSB is required now where most of our flights need to get to. And the purpose on the part of the FAA is they need to quickly identify the type of flight, in other words, to know that it's a public benefit flight or whatever, the pilot and the public benefit flying group, if contact is lost, if there's a technical problem, or a 9/11 type issue. So our system includes the fact that we can look up, in fact, Chris can look up on request of the FAA and find out what that CMF number, who it has been assigned to, what group is flying it, so they can make the appropriate contacts and make sure it's a valid flight. Otherwise, remember, with ADSB, Big Brother is watching you. And there's a wonderful story in flying about an extremely high time, very revered pilot who got bit and lost all of her certificates all the way up to ATP as a result of doing something foolish and having a problem with ADSB. So we must follow those rules that are set and procedures that have been adopted for call signs. Our new procedures are a little bit different, not that different in terms of actual use. A pilot who wishes to be assigned a unique call sign must be a member of a public benefit flying group that has been authorized by us. And this is because, it's because the FAA has assigned the call sign to ACA for administration. And so we need to be able to track back and get hold of the pilot in the event that they need to track down who is actually using that call sign. The procedure is to register online at the Air Care Alliance, and we have a list there that says which groups have signed up for it. And if the group is there, the pilot can choose one or more groups that they belong to. That automatically goes to those groups, and if each of them or one of them verifies the pilot, they can use the call sign for missions for that particular group. Pilot is also provided in our documentation all the requirements that are required under the call sign regulations, ICAO regulations, and all that. So we will then issue the call sign identifier and number. The format, of course, is CMF with up to 4 digits, and the radio call would be compassion 1, 2, 3, 4, or whatever it is. There are wonderful benefits. ADSB provides access to important airspace. Controllers recognize the special nature of it. Often controllers will provide special handling or routing, and that can be even more important for passengers if the pilot can get a smoother flight or deal with an oxygen issue. During disasters, operations by volunteer pilots flying for groups, assuming that they have the authorization from the controlling authorities in perhaps a temporary flight restricted area or whatever, then the controllers will allow access. And in terms of visibility, I think it's really great that having a dedicated call sign exposes the aviation community at large to the wide variety of operations that are being conducted, and improves the public understanding of public benefit flying. In terms of numbers, we have more than 1,500 pilots now registered to use Compassion. 10 authorized groups have participated so far, and there's another group in process. We haven't had problems from the Air Care Alliance point of view. The main thing is to correct misinformation that we find out there on the web, and that we've had no complaints about our administration of it from the FAA. So from our point of view, it's working really well. And our hope is that the pilots are finding it works just as easily as the old system. We had a couple of questions here. Ooh, excuse me. What if the ADSB transponder has a fixed ID? I'm sorry, if it is truly a fixed ID, if you can't change it, you have to use your IN number or whatever is programmed in. Now, the fact is that a lot of people think their transponder has a fixed ID because they turn the knobs and so on and so forth and nothing changes. But most times the transponder just simply needs to be enabled by an avionics shop. A few years ago, people who were installing ADSB did not even think about the fact that it might need to be reprogrammed. But check with the shop, check with the manufacturer, and perhaps it can be programmed. A little side note of that, there is the possibility that the manufacturer, if they're motivated to do so, may be able to enable it using a software patch to the software within the transponder itself. It may have to go to a shop to be completely reprogrammed, but that's something to ask about if they say, no, it can't be done. How about renting leaseback planes? I would suggest if you're going to be renting a plane from an FBO, you should ask if it has programmable ID and find out how it works. If not, you should request another airplane that does, or ask the FBO to work with the owner to unlock the transponder. Otherwise, if that transponder cannot be programmed, then you cannot make the call sign in your flight plan match what is being transmitted, and you must use the programmed ID. That's pretty straightforward, I think. Final thing, Chris is going to put some links for you in the chat box and wherever else she provides information back to all of us. Of course, we have the website, which I'm sure all of you have memorized thoroughly and that you've parsed carefully. We have extensive facts there, far more than I've just covered in this discussion, including the full procedures, requirements, and details. And the registration page provides a little bit about the benefits of the call sign. And through that process, you can find out which groups have qualified to see if your group is there. If your group is not qualified, you can talk to them and say, hey, you know, we should be using the compassion call sign, and you can find that out. So in short, thank you. And I'll leave it to Chris and Josh to tell me of any questions that we might have time for.
Sure. So we do have a couple of questions for you all. For pilots who volunteer for one or more ACA groups and Angel Flight, do we use Angel Flight, the NGF call sign for Angel Flights, and CMF for all other ACA groups? Should CMF not be used for Angel Flights?
Well, there are, I think, almost a dozen Angel Flight groups. 6 of them are part of the Air Charity Network, which has uses the NGF call sign, the Angel Flight call sign. And there's been a interesting back and forth on that, because we developed the compassion call sign, and then Angel Flight used exactly the same procedures, you know, including using the N number to create your own call sign. And then years later, when all this stuff happened with the new needs, Angel Flight developed the procedures for that with the FAA, and we were able to ride along with not much modification. But the bottom line is you have to know which call sign is being used by which group. So there are several different Angel Flight groups which use compassion. There are 6 Angel Flight groups that use Angel Flight, and you just have to ask and find out.
Right. Question, if somebody puts the word compassion in the remarks of their flight plan, won't they get the same treatment as if they use a CMF compassion call sign?
Well, I mentioned earlier that having anything in the remarks section of a flight plan is actually mostly useful in the event something goes wrong and they have to track down what happened. The controllers, active controllers, when you take off from an airport, really aren't going to see those remarks unless they switch to a different, and this is my understanding speaking with controllers, unless they switch to a different page and actually look for the remarks. And if it's in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you know, they're not going to have any reason to be looking for remarks. So I would say that if they had a reason to look and they looked, then they would be able to see, you know, compassion, and they would be able to deal with that. But theoretically, they should not be using compassion as part of their verbal call sign in the air. They should be using their N number. And it gets very confusing when it goes from sector to sector, because, you know, after getting it straightened out with the one controller in one sector, you would end up having to, either the controller would have to pass the information to the next sector's controller, or you would have to re-explain why you're calling yourself compassion when your ADSB unit is squawking, you know, November 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the bottom line is it probably won't do you any good. It won't hurt anything, but it probably won't do any good. The other thing to remember is that the compassion call sign has been assigned by the FAA to the Air Care Alliance for administration, and has stipulated and worked with us on the requirements. And the requirements don't provide anything now for it being included in the flight plan and not used in the ADSB unit.
Great. I think we have time for one more call sign question. This is from David Gianna. I have a compassion call sign. After my club upgraded the transponders in the fleet, I found that the feature to modify the ADSB label was disabled in all of the fleet transponders. I concluded that I could no longer use the call sign after this. However, someone recently told me that the ACA call sign applies to the pilot, not to the aircraft. Is it okay to use the CMF call sign without changing the tail number, which is correct?
It's exactly the same thing. That the tail number, in other words, the N number that is painted on the airplane, if that's what's programmed in the ADSB unit, and that's what is being, you know, broadcast, then compassion can be used. But if that fleet has been locked out so that people cannot program it with compassion before the flight, then they should not be using compassion. It's just confusing, and especially going from sector to sector.
Great. Thank you, Raul. As you mentioned, we'll put links to all of the information about call sign in the chat. We'll try to get back to some of the other questions. And Raul, if you want to type answers to any that you see, that would be great. If you could stop your share, I'll go ahead and introduce our final speaker tonight.
All righty, thank you.
Here we go. It's my pleasure to introduce Brigadier General Edward Felka. General Felka is the National Vice Commander of Civil Air Patrol. His primary duty is to assist the National Commander in leading CAP's more than 60,000 volunteers in fulfillment of their 3 congressionally chartered missions, which are emergency services, cadet programs, and aerospace education, as well as its steadily increasing role in America's homeland security. More than 7 state wings of Civil Air Patrol recently participated in the time-sensitive distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. Many volunteer pilots and organizations alike have expressed a lot of interest in this. And General Felka is here today to tell us all about their efforts and what other volunteer pilot organizations might learn from their experience. Over to you.
All right, just want to make sure you can see my screen. Should be sharing now. Does that look good to you? Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, it's my pleasure to be with you today. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And I'm trying to get Zoom out of the way so I can actually use my screen here. This is kind of crazy. So many different virtual platforms. Quick overview, what I'll talk about Civil Air Patrol's status. Not everybody necessarily knows about Civil Air Patrol, so I'll brief you on that quickly. As Chris mentioned, COVID-19 relief operations definitely includes vaccine transport, and I'll bring it together with a couple of conclusions. So I expect many of you are already familiar with Civil Air Patrol. In fact, I'm betting that there are a lot of Civil Air Patrol members on tonight's meeting. We are volunteers at heart, and everybody on this call, volunteer pilots, public benefit, we're all after the same thing. But for those who don't know, Civil Air Patrol has been around since 1941. We were first formed by a group of civilian pilots who wanted to contribute their skills to the defense of America's shores when enemy submarines were menacing ships along the shores, and to help train pilots for future military service. Civil Air Patrol has a proud 80-year history, and today we are the official civilian auxiliary of the United States Air Force, performing the 3 missions that Chris mentioned that were actually chartered to us by Congress: aerospace education of our members and the public, one of the finest youth development programs in the nation, which we call our cadet program, and a wide variety and huge array of emergency services, everything from search and rescue to disaster relief, homeland security, counter-drug missions, and assistance to various state and federal agencies. CAP's array of 557 aircraft is the largest fleet of single-engine piston aircraft in the world. And we use these aircraft for search and rescue, disaster relief, flight training, including our cadets, orientation flights for our cadets, and most recently, COVID-19 relief missions, including vaccine transport. We also operate the nation's largest public service fleet of small unmanned aerial systems. We have more than 2,000 registered SUASs. So I mentioned a moment ago that we are the official civilian auxiliary of the U.S. Air Force. We are also a congressionally chartered 501c3 corporation. The legal authority of those 2 designations is found in Title 10 and Title 36, respectively. And with regard to what we do for public benefit flying, specific to the pandemic, CAP is fulfilling our purposes under those clauses. If you look it up in Title 36, voluntary contribution of private citizens to the public welfare. That's one of the things Congress said we should do. That's what we're doing for COVID-19 relief. To provide an organization of private citizens with adequate facilities to assist in meeting local and national emergencies. I'd say we have that going on right now, and to assist the Department of the Air Force in fulfilling its non-combat programs and missions. Civil Air Patrol is a non-combat, unarmed civilian auxiliary of the Air Force. Though we do wear the Air Force style uniform, we are not a combat force. A lot of what we've been doing for COVID-19 relief goes directly to those purposes that were outlined by Congress. And it was mentioned earlier, talking about FAA exemptions. In order to accomplish the purposes set forth for us in Civil Air Patrol, we have a large contingent of pilots across the country. They range in experience from student pilots learning to fly, lots of private pilots, all the way up to retired airline and military pilots with tens of thousands of hours of experience. I know the Air Care Alliance has dealt with questions surrounding fuel reimbursement. We heard about it earlier tonight, specifically for private pilots. CAP has 2 exemption letters from the FAA that assist us in accomplishing our missions without asking private pilots to pay for the privilege of doing so. One exemption is specific to 61.113 on private pilot fuel reimbursement. The other deals with subpart F of part 91, just so long as CAP is performing operations consistent with 91.501B. So COVID-19 relief missions. Today is our 400th consecutive day of performing COVID-19 relief missions. A significant number of these missions is being done on the ground, but we do have a lot of flying going on. In fact, over 1,700 air sorties has been flown. This is our single largest mobilization since World War II. So as I said, 400 straight days. The color codes on the map show the different kinds of missions decoded on the lower left there. We're also in the top 1% of Red Cross blood drives. All 52 of our wings have participated. That's all 50 states plus Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands, as well as the DC area. That's considered a wing for us. Over 44,250 volunteer days have been contributed, and a volunteer day is a volunteer person's 8-hour time commitment. As you can see, there are lots of statistics. All those meals that we've been involved with, over 1,200,000 pounds of bulk food, 8 million meals actually distributed. And there on the bottom, you see 7,526 vials of life-saving vaccine has been distributed by our air crews and in some cases our ground crews. A couple of photos of what our members are doing. And I chose some photos that show us working alongside members of the military. You can see Civil Air Patrol members and members of the military are hard to distinguish unless you know exactly what insignia you're looking for. So our members are very proud to be the auxiliary of the U.S. Air Force. And especially in COVID-19 relief, we've been working very closely especially with the National Guard. We've been doing everything from meal distribution to flying personal protective equipment, driving it around, flying test kits and test samples back and forth to where they're needed and where they're being evaluated. And the center picture there on the bottom is a picture of a recent vaccine transport mission, which was highlighted on a Fox News story that I think is probably what got Chris to call me. She saw the story, she heard my name, and she reached out to me. 2 friends of mine there, Robert on the left and Rod on the right, they flew from Minnesota to Michigan with some U.S. Public Health Service officers to distribute vials of vaccine to Native American communities. I'll put the link to that story at the end of the presentation for you. CAP has longstanding relationships with multiple federal agencies, which led to us being requested specifically to do vaccine transport. Since the vaccines were approved, CAP has transported, as I said, over 7,500 vials. Because vaccines must be kept at an extremely low temperatures, our operations specialists were very careful to examine the risks associated with vaccine transport. Our organization did a lot of research, and we were looking at the hazardous materials that was involved, and the major package that Pfizer was putting together had, I think it was 55 pounds of dry ice in the 80-pound box. FAA Advisory Circular 9176 Alpha provided specific guidance, as did some other resources that we found. And because our small single-engine piston aircraft don't have separate cargo holds, and because there was no specific data available on cabin air refresh rate for the types of planes we fly, our organization decided against transporting dry ice in large quantities. Instead, all the vaccine vials that we transported were repackaged by the shipper into different types of coolers that did not contain any hazardous materials. So should any Air Care Alliance organization be approached about vaccine transport, I believe careful consideration should be given to any hazardous materials that are part of the shipment. So just real quick, as a moment ago, CAP's long-standing relationships with federal agencies were mentioned. This record of great relationships with organizations makes it easier for Civil Air Patrol to be tasked. Normally, a governor would have to go through the Office of the Secretary of Defense and have it go all the way around through NORAD and NORTHCOM to come down to the Air Force. But fortunately, Civil Air Patrol can help shortcut that process. Air Force policy endorsed by the Office of Secretary of Defense allows for CAP to be tasked from state and local agencies and bypass the Secretary of Defense approval process. And it's because CAP employment does not impact Air Force combat capability. It allows CAP to be tasked quicker. Lots and lots of organizations can task us, but we never self-deploy. Taskings for our missions and resources can come from the DoD, various federal agencies, state and local organizations, NGOs. They flow either to the Air Force or to our National Operations Center first, and funding from our operations comes from a congressional appropriation or from another state or federal source, depending on the type of mission that's being flown. CAP pilots are also eligible for funded proficiency flying and can pursue advanced ratings such as instrument commercial or CFI using CAP instructors who cannot charge for their time, as well as CAP aircraft, which are offered essentially at cost. Our reach is tremendous. On the map here, you see a dot for every one of our more than 1,400 local units. We have an incredible geography going from Puerto Rico to Alaska, from Maine to Hawaii, as well as overseas squadrons that are in South Korea, Japan, England, Belgium, and Germany. Our overseas units do not operate aircraft, or they do not participate in emergency services. They mainly exist for our cadet program, but we do have military members who have families, and those folks can participate in Civil Air Patrol when they're deployed. So everyone listening on this call is likely a volunteer pilot or associated with the volunteer flying organization, willing to lend your professional skills to ease the suffering of your fellow citizens' communities. I find that commendable, and I find it inspirational. CAP is always looking for more volunteers, so this is my recruiting pitch. We're especially in need of pilots and flight instructors. So I would ask you to consider visiting our website and exploring CAP's presence in your community. We'd love to have you join us. On the bottom there is the link to the Fox News story I promised. If you want to hit me up in the chat, I'd be happy to answer any additional questions that you might have, but that's what I've got for you.
Thank you, General Falca. The really important work that you all are doing there. And I do have a couple of questions for General Falca here, but I would encourage anybody else to go ahead and type whatever questions you might have for him, or also any of our other panelists. We'll do have a couple of minutes here at the end. But General Falca, is there still a need for general aviation to transport vaccines and maybe ancillary supplies, in your opinion, or has kind of normal distribution channels taken over that now?
You know, from what we've learned in the Civil Air Patrol, the vast majority of vaccine distribution is effectively managed by the logistics network that the government has been utilizing, all the various cargo transports and airlines. And the CAP has been involved mostly in transportation to rural areas that are not necessarily well served by that major logistics network. So we've been contacted sort of on an emergency basis. So I would say that the need for vaccine transport for general aviation is probably relatively low. However, the other items that can be transported, like personal protective equipment, I would say that demand continues. Those items are needed all across the country. In any place that has an airport, I think general aviation could lend an important helping hand in those areas.
Thank you. You did mention that in order to transport them, you weren't allowed to use the dry ice on your flights. Not having the dry ice kind of increases the time sensitivity of those types of flights. Do you have any suggestions or tips for pilots on how they can get their itis that might come along with a time-sensitive flight like that?
Absolutely. The answer is don't accept a mission if it's that time sensitive, unless you're absolutely certain that it can be done. We are very, very, very careful in Civil Air Patrol about risk management. And we have, in order to launch a Civil Air Patrol airplane on a sortie, it requires us to go through an operational risk matrix and have a flight release officer who double checks and asks you a series of questions. It's not quite a dispatcher, it doesn't rise to that level, but we take great pains to mitigate the risks associated with CAP flying. Our aircraft are not equipped to fly in known icing conditions, so we certainly will not launch. That's prohibited. It's not even allowed by the POH of the airplanes that we fly, and we simply will not do that. So the flight that's featured in the Fox News story, it actually took several days for the weather to cooperate for us to be able to accomplish that flight. It wasn't get the airplane there, fly the vaccine right now. It was get an airplane here as soon as you can, and when the weather permits, let's fly the vaccine to where it's needed. So we actually waited 3 days. Our crew was in a hotel for 3 days waiting for the weather to clear. And once it did, the vaccine was repackaged into cartons that had basically a shelf life, and we accomplished the mission safely without compromising the vaccine or the safety of our crew.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. There was a question for Raul about about configuring the Adsb transponder. Is there any information out there for how to do that for particular units, or how might a pilot figure out how they can do that for their particular plane?
One source of information that's kept up pretty much to date is at AOPA. They have a whole guide by make and model of transponder on how to do that. It should be up to date, and if there's a particular transponder that you can't find information, check with the AOPA help folks, and they'll probably put that transponder into the list along with the instructions for it. The other source is to go on, and by the way, the helpline is 1-800-USA-AOPA, or you can do it via email. The other source, a pretty good source, you can just go to Google and Google the make and model and the question, and particularly on YouTube. There are a lot of YouTube videos that go step by step for many different transponders, so that may be a useful resource for you as well.
Yeah, I found a few videos on YouTube that do a really good job. We use YouTube for everything nowadays, right? Why not how to program your Adsb as well?
Absolutely. Thank you.
I have a quick question for the Brigadier General. A number of years ago, Civil Air Patrol partnered with charitable air aviation organizations for patient transport in general, and then that was halted, I think mostly because of kind of a high incident accident that happened. Quick question, do you know, is that ever reconsidered? Could it be reconsidered for either patient transport or some of the other missions associated with the Air Care Alliance in terms of using airplanes to benefit the community?
You know, I can't give you a definitive yes or no on whether that would be reconsidered. I imagine we could certainly bring up the question, but it was as far as we were concerned, it was a question of corporate risk, and our corporation decided to not do patient transport. There's a long story behind that, but I can certainly bring it up to our corporate counsel and see if that's something that could be reconsidered. The answer is I don't know.
This is Raul. Just to follow on that, is just a few years ago, we achieved a liability relief in Congress for, at least for the pilots, for flying public benefit missions. So you might want to have them take a look at that in terms of their evaluation of risk as far as the liability goes.
You know, Raul, I'd be very happy to chat with you offline about that. And I imagine, since you know our Chief Operating Officer, John Salvador, I'm sure he'd be happy to take your call as well to discuss that. Be happy to discuss it with you.
Yes, and John has been very helpful in the past, and he actually arranged at one of our first conferences for the acting chief counsel of CAP to come and conduct a session for us back in Maryland at the AOPA headquarters, where we discussed exemptions, because CAP has one of probably the longest list of exemptions of any organizations in the country that they've negotiated with the FAA.
And interestingly, our exemptions expired and we had to get them renewed. And when they expired, we practically ceased operations, including COVID-19 relief missions, because we didn't want to transport non-owned cargo. And you know, historically, our pilots had received reimbursement for Civil Air Patrol missions because that's how things had been done in CAP. And in the interest of not wanting anyone to be violated, violated by the FAA, we stopped operations until the exemptions were renewed. And kudos to the FAA, knowing that there was a public need out there for this type of mission. They jumped through hoops and quickly evaluated our reapplication for those exemptions, and they were renewed. So we have those exemptions again, and those are available on the FAA's website, I believe, if you want to see what they look like. But we find them incredibly useful.
Yeah, I know that CAP also has a good discussion of the exemptions on the CAP site, buried in the documentation somewhere. I went through and found it. Another thing to mention is that the FAA has actually worked with us on making the exemptions easier. They aren't as restrictive as they used to be, and they've listened. There's still a lot to do to try and make them as flexible as possible, given the wide variety of missions that our volunteer pilots accomplish. But I commend you and CAP. I'm a CAP educator member, so I really like CAP. You do good work.
Chris,
Well,
if
thank
I
you.
could,
I couldn't agree more. I appreciate the great feedback. Sorry, go ahead.
oh, sorry, Chris, if I could stick something in, there was a question as to whether number of volunteer flights would increase if there were fuel reimbursement or other reimbursement. I think the history of the CAP with the number of flights it makes, their level of safety indicates that reimbursement for public benefit flying can be a win-win for everybody involved. And I've been familiar with CAP since I was a cadet, and really impressed with what they're doing. And I'm thinking, as I said, we're supporting the folks who are working to make the regulations a little more friendly for volunteer flying. And I think the CAP is an example of how this could be very successful.
Well, thanks, Rick. It's great to hear that you're a former cadet. I'm a former cadet as well, so we share that. For the pilots in Civil Air Patrol, in order to be able to be reimbursed for their flying, there is a series of hoops that have to be jumped through. Annual check rides, mission pilot training, mission pilot check rides every 2 years. And of course, our fleet is corporate owned, and the maintenance is very strictly adhered to. So it's not just jump in an airplane and go and then collect a check for the fuel. It's a time commitment, and it's a safety commitment. You're absolutely right about that. We're very proud of our safety record. It exceeds the safety record of general aviation, and we operate a very consistent fleet of Cessna 172, 182, 206, and a variety of other outliers. But our pilots are very well trained. We have very experienced instructors who do the training and the evaluation. And we are always, as I said, looking for more pilots and more instructors because our missions are increasing.
Thank you, everybody. It looks like we are coming up on time here, but I did want to thank each and every one of our presenters for being with us tonight and answering all of your questions. And I'd like to thank each and every person who attended this town hall for your interest and support of public benefit flying. I know you're here because it means something to you. It means something to all of us, and we're grateful to be able to support this sector and volunteer pilots like you. We hope you'll stay connected with the Air Care Alliance. You can visit our website to find more information on volunteer flying and all of the topics presented here tonight. We'd love it if you follow us on Facebook. And if you'd like to get in touch, my contact information has been put into the chat there. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions or feedback or an issue that you would like some help on. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you all for joining, and I hope you have a great night.